What if one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history wasn't just an accident with an iceberg, but part of a carefully laid plan? On the night of April 14th to 15th, 1912, Titanic struck an iceberg and sank, taking about 1,500 lives. In that context, the absence of J.P. Morgan, the most powerful banker of his age, feels striking. He had been announced by the press as a passenger, and later reports even suggested that some of his luggage was placed aboard. Yet, when the ship sailed, Morgan was not there. Officially, he cancelled at the last moment. Some cited health reasons, though observers later noted he appeared relaxed and well at a French resort. This remains an odd, documented discrepancy that helped fuel later speculation. It may have been nothing more than a change of plans, but it opened the door for questions that still linger. Let's quietly follow the clues. If this story intrigues you, comment below. We'll examine the facts and the claims together. J.P. Morgan's absence from Titanic has remained one of the quiet mysteries circling the disaster. Contemporary newspapers listed him among the prominent names expected to be on board, and some reports even claimed that luggage marked with his initials had been loaded in preparation. Yet, when the ship departed Southampton, Morgan was not among the passengers. In the aftermath, this small but noticeable gap in the record began to draw attention. Understanding why people cared about his non-appearance requires a look at what was at stake. Titanic was more than a ship, it was a symbol. Built and operated by the White Star Line, which in turn was part of the International Mercantile Marine Company, the financial empire behind it traced back to Morgan's influence. He didn't personally manage Titanic's day-to-day operation, but through IM he wielded significant financial control over White Star Line and its fleet. For a man so closely tied to the company's fortunes, sitting out the maiden voyage of its most celebrated vessel seemed remarkable. The explanation offered at the time was straightforward. Morgan had withdrawn for health reasons. He was in his mid-70s, an age when travel was less certain, and he was known to be dealing with ongoing medical issues. From that perspective, his decision could easily be seen as practical. However, reports surfaced soon after, stating that he had been spotted in France, living comfortably at a resort. While the press portrayed him as in good condition, contemporaries debated his health, and the historical record remains ambiguous. Those conflicting impressions created space for speculation. It's important to remember that Morgan did not live long beyond the tragedy. He died in 1913, just months before the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law at the end of that year. This complicates claims that he deliberately avoided Titanic to profit from the deaths of rivals and then orchestrate the law's passage. While Morgan's financial empire carried on after him, his personal role ended before those political changes were completed. Still, his absence on Titanic remains a detail that critics and supporters of conspiracy theories revisit. One reason the story endures is the paper trail left behind. Newspapers printed his name alongside other high-profile passengers, cementing in the public mind the idea that he was meant to be on board. When people later learned that he had not sailed, the contrast became glaring. Promotional notices presented one version of events, reality delivered another. That simple discrepancy, announced to sail, absent at departure, encouraged questions. This is why Morgan's name lingers in discussions of Titanic. Some see a pattern in which influential figures avoid calamity, while others around them do not, interpreting such timing as too precise to dismiss. In Morgan's case, the suspicion gains traction because many of the men who did board the ship carried significant influence in finance and politics, while he was safely on the continent. To those inclined to suspicion, that contrast feels intentional. Others caution against reading too much into the coincidence. Early 20th century reporting often relied on expected itineraries or vague statements rather than firm booking confirmations. A man of Morgan's stature could be attached to Titanic's voyage by assumption rather than fact. It's possible newspapers were simply eager to link his name to the celebrated liner. From this angle, his absence may not have signaled hidden knowledge, but only the shifting travel plans of an aging financier balancing work, illness, and personal comfort. What holds attention is not only the question of whether Morgan intended to board, but the company he did not keep. On that voyage were some of the wealthiest men in America, individuals with reputations for influence in business and finance. Their presence on Titanic, contrasted with Morgan's absence, forms the foundation for a great deal of speculation today. The story doesn't end with one banker who chose to remain ashore. It extends to those who stepped on board, never to return. And it is their names, as much as Morgan's, that continue to shape the mystery tied to the ship's fate. On the passenger list of Titanic were names that now carry more than a trace of historical weight. Three of the most notable were John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus. Each man represented extraordinary influence within American business, society, and in Straus's case, politics. Their presence on that doomed voyage is often cited in conspiratorial accounts as more than coincidence, especially when set against J.P. Morgan's absence. According to those narratives, the loss of these figures removed some influential voices at a moment when debates over centralized banking were becoming more urgent in the United States. The Federal Reserve Act was passed in December 1913, the very next year, and this timing is one reason speculation endures. Still, historians caution that the actual record of these men as outspoken opponents to a central bank is uneven or unclear. John Jacob Astor IV stood among the wealthiest men in America. His family fortune came through real estate and trade, but he also carved a reputation of his own as an inventor and occasional writer. He even published a work of early science fiction, showing interests that reached beyond finance. In conspiracy retellings, Astor's power and independence are said to have made him a natural obstacle to efforts that would centralize monetary authority. Yet evidence that he actively opposed the creation of a Federal Reserve is scarce. Contemporary accounts place him more in the role of a wealthy patron and intellectual curiosity of his age than a fierce critic of banking reforms. His stature, however, ensures his name is repeatedly drawn into these theories as someone whose very position gave him potential influence. Benjamin Guggenheim carried another kind of significance. His family's prosperity came through mining and metals, and his investments built strong ties to heavy industry. A detail that surfaces often in alternative accounts is his reported financial support of Nikola Tesla's work. A connection that sparks wider theories about suppressed innovation and energy monopolies. The idea that he backed Tesla feeds the image of Guggenheim as a figure unafraid to take risks, even those that challenged entrenched corporate power, whether this role was exaggerated after the fact or not. His abrupt death on Titanic is folded into the narrative that independent investors were removed just as the financial world tilted toward consolidation. Isidor Straus brought yet another dimension. As co-owner of Macy's department store and a former United States congressman, he existed at the intersection of wealth and politics. His public service had included work on economic matters, and he was respected as both a businessman and civic leader. Conspiratorial accounts place him firmly among those reluctant towards central banking policies. Yet the documentation here is thin. Historians note his record does not show a clear, organized stance against the creation of the Federal Reserve. Some even suggest Straus held more moderate or mixed views. What is certain is that he was a man of stature whose personal presence in political life meant his death resonated far beyond his family. In considering these three men, it becomes important to separate symbolic weight from documented belief. The claim that they formed a trio of committed opponents to central banking appears stronger when viewed through hindsight than in their actual words and actions. Historians point out that the evidence is not clear-cut, and in some cases the men's attitudes may have been different from how they are later portrayed. Still, in conspiracy traditions, their collective absence from public life after April 1912 is treated as significant, especially since the Federal Reserve debate culminated so soon afterward. Alongside questions of influence, their final hours offer deeply human moments. Accounts record Astor ensuring his pregnant young wife secured a place on a lifeboat before stepping aside himself. Guggenheim, once he accepted the ship's fate, put on evening clothes and remarked that he would go down as a gentleman. Straus refused to abandon his wife. The two remained together until the end. These details, separate from any political or financial speculation, remind us of the vulnerability all passengers faced that icy night. They also explain why stories of these men retain such emotional resonance. Behind the theories are lives and choices that made them remembered for dignity as much as position. The coincidence that intrigues theorists is the alignment between their sudden absence from the national stage and the continued progress of banking reform. Their deaths removed influential voices at a moment when banking debates had not yet been settled. Whether these men would have actively resisted the Federal Reserve Act remains uncertain, but the neatness of the pattern fuels ongoing fascination. Critics argue it is more a story of perception than proof, shaped by contrasts between lived tragedy and subsequent historical outcomes. When viewed together, their roles remind us how swiftly events can concentrate meaning, whether intended or accidental. The Titanic's sinking claimed not just ordinary travelers, but public figures whose deaths became entangled with debates reaching far beyond the ship itself. And that invites a broader question. As much as people look at who was lost or who was spared, could the conditions surrounding the ship itself have played just as decisive a role in shaping what happened that night? When thinking about Titanic's legacy, attention often turns to the interplay between prestige, power, and the ship's physical vulnerabilities. This combination of human ambition and material fragility forms what could be called patterns of power and fragile steel. While the iceberg delivered the final blow, evidence suggests Titanic may have carried weaknesses long before that night. One much discussed detail is a coal bunker fire that was burning even before the voyage began. Coal stored in large piles could ignite from internal heat, and reports confirm that a smouldering fire was underway as Titanic prepared to leave port. Some investigators argue that this fire may have weakened hull plating in the area where the iceberg later struck, perhaps making the damage worse than it otherwise would have been. Others caution that coal fires were a known issue on steamships, usually managed by shifting fuel and keeping it under control. The theory remains debated, but it highlights how unseen stresses may have shaped events that only became visible much later. Adding to this perspective is modern forensic research into Titanic's structure. In 1998, metallurgical analysis of rivet samples recovered from the wreck found that many of the rivets used in parts of the hull were made of wrought iron, containing high levels of slag impurities. Tests showed these rivets were more brittle than higher-grade steel fastenings. Under the force of a collision, such rivets could pop or shear, allowing seams to open quickly. This helps explain why what some historians call a relatively modest scrape along the starboard side resulted in rapid flooding throughout multiple compartments. Titanic's reputation as a ship built to withstand disaster was complicated by the reality that some of her materials did not perform as strongly as expected. Photographs taken as Titanic left Southampton have also drawn attention. Careful viewers sometimes point to dark markings visible on the forward hull plates. While they may simply be shadows from lighting at the dock, others suggest they could indicate heat damage from the coal bunker fire, offering a visual clue to a weakened section. Whether these observations represent evidence of structural compromise or coincidence remains uncertain, but they deepen the sense that Titanic was not as flawless as her image suggested. Beyond the steel itself, limits in safety planning further exposed passengers and crew. Titanic carried 20 lifeboats, a mix of standard boats and collapsibles, with space for about 1,178 people. That was only enough for roughly half of those on board, since more than 2,200 passengers and crew had sailed. Regulations at the time had not kept pace with the size of the ships, and Britain's Board of Trade formally approved Titanic as legally compliant despite the shortfall. On the surface, the vessel met existing standards. In practice, those standards offered too little protection against a disaster of that scale. Even training for emergencies was affected. Accounts note that a scheduled lifeboat drill was cancelled on the final Sunday before departure, an administrative change that might have seemed minor at the time, but left the crew less practiced when crisis arrived. Combined with the shortage of boats, it created conditions where confusion and delay directly cost lives. Communication on the night of April 14th made matters worse. While Titanic's Marconi operators were active, they were also busy handling passenger messages and dismissed or delayed some ice warnings sent from nearby ships. The closest vessel, the Californian, had stopped for the night in an ice field and switched off its wireless. Had contact been kept open, rescue forces could have arrived more quickly, but with silence on one end and overload on the other, those hours passed without help. Survivors later recalled seeing the lights of Californian in the distance, while distress rockets went unanswered. Taken together, these separate factors form a chain of shortcomings: a possible fire before sailing, brittle rivets in the hull, a lifeboat system approved under outdated rules, drills left undone, and critical wireless messages disregarded. None of these on their own explains Titanic's loss, but they combine to magnify the consequences of that single collision. It was not perfection undone by one unlucky strike, but a ship already vulnerable in unseen ways. And that brings us back to the wider lens. Alongside questions of who boarded and who did not, Titanic's story is shaped just as much by fragile materials, limited safeguards, and chance moments of missed response. When we line up these details, we find not just a shipwreck, but a portrait of early 20th century ambition meeting its limits. More than a century has passed, yet the pull of these patterns and the questions they raise remain as strong as ever. In the end, Titanic's story sits between coincidence and circumstance. Morgan's decision not to sail, the loss of Astor, Guggenheim and Strauss, and the ship's fragile weaknesses all leave space for speculation. Conspiracy accounts see a plan. Historical evidence reminds us of brittle rivets, design limits, human error, and unlucky timing. There is no smoking gun proof Morgan ordered a sinking, yet his absence, paired with the deaths of influential figures, remains difficult for some to ignore. The facts anchor us. On April 14th and 15th, 1912, Titanic sank. About 1,500 lives were lost, and in December 1913 the Federal Reserve Act was passed. Against this, counter-arguments matter. Large ship-switch theories face logistical hurdles. Clear evidence of opposition to the central bank is limited, and Morgan himself died before the act was signed. Which details feel like coincidence to you, and which suggest something deeper? Tell us what part surprised you most, and if you enjoy calm explorations of history's mysteries, consider subscribing.